I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, April 21st. Tonight, Russia announces victory in the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol. Russian President Vladimir Putin says the completion of combat work to, quote, liberate Mariupol is a success. He's claiming victory even as he ordered his troops not to storm a giant steel plant where an estimated 2,000 Ukrainian fighters and about 1,000 civilians are now trapped. Mr. Putin says for now he won't risk sending troops into the 11 square kilometer warren of tunnels under the plant. He instead prefers to isolate the holdouts, quote, so that not even a fly comes through. All right, well, meanwhile, Russia is imposing sanctions on 61 Canadians. It claims these individuals are all, quote, directly involved in the development, substantiation, and implementation of the Russophobic course of the ruling regime in Canada. The list includes the premiers of Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia, the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, and the governor of the Bank of Canada. Earlier this week, Canada imposed sanctions on another 14 Russians with close ties to President Vladimir Putin, saying they are complicit in Russia's unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine. All right, turning to an important meeting between the Pope and a delegation of Indigenous representatives. Manitoba Métis Federation President David Chartrand says a delegation's meeting with Pope Francis today at the Vatican was a very powerful way to start the healing process. Mr. Chartrand says Pope Francis took ownership of the harms of the Roman Catholic Church in the residential school system. Earlier this month, the Pope held meetings with Métis, Inuit, and First Nations delegates, and he apologized for the deplorable conduct of church members involved in the schools. The Trudeau government is facing backlash against plans to allow provinces to ban handguns. In a letter to Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino, several high-profile groups, including the Coalition for Gun Control and the Quebec City Mosque, where 6 people were killed, say regional measures will lead to a disastrous patchwork across Canada. They say it would be a political, legal, and public safety disaster, and they are instead calling for nationwide measures to phase out the private ownership of handguns. Canada needs a COVID-19 detection system. This, according to the scientific director of Ontario's COVID-19 Science Advisory Table. He says it could show what's actually happening in communities in terms of infection rates. Dr. Peter Juni and others agree that a system is needed in the absence of wide-scale PCR testing. Rapid antigen tests aren't as reliable at detecting the Omicron variant, nor are they reported and tracked the way PCR tests are. Experts say there needs to be a better way of informing people about COVID-19 activity in their communities. Uber is making moves to ease COVID protocols within its business. The ride-hailing and delivery company has announced the use of masks by drivers and passengers will no longer be required in most of Canada as of tomorrow. But the company says it still strongly recommends the use of masking. It also says individual drivers can require customers to wear a mask and cancel a trip for those who refuse. The same goes for passengers who can cancel trips if they want to wear a mask, but the driver does not. The change in policy does not apply to Quebec, which has extended its mask mandate amid a new wave of COVID-19. A charity is hailing Health Canada for approving what it calls the single greatest innovation in the history of cystic fibrosis. Cystic Fibrosis Canada says the drug Trikafta has been approved for use in kids age 6 and up with at least one CF gene mutation. The drug was already greenlit last year for those 12 and older, but the charity says lowering the eligibility to younger children means the life-changing drug can treat up to 90% of Canadians with cystic fibrosis and address its underlying causes. The group is now calling on provinces, territories, and private insurers to fund Trikafta for those age 6 and up. On the East Coast, the first cruise ship to pull into an Atlantic Canadian port in over 2 years is scheduled to dock in Charlottetown tomorrow. The Viking Octantis was initially supposed to visit Louisbourg, Nova Scotia today, but canceled due to bad weather. According to the Atlantic Canada Cruise Association, cruise ships contributed $347 million to the region's economy before the pandemic. Queen Elizabeth II is marking her 96th birthday privately today. She is retreating to the Sandringham estate in eastern England. It has offered the monarch and her late husband, Prince Philip, a refuge from the affairs of state. This birthday comes during the Queen's Platinum Jubilee year, marking her 70 years on the throne. A look at cannabis and investing up next. Cannabis stocks dipped yesterday. However, investors remain optimistic on the heels of 420. The marijuana industry is expected to grow to double its value by 2025. Canada became the second country in the world to legalize cannabis on October 17, 2018. Recreational cannabis is also legal in 18 states in the U.S. So what does this growing market mean for investors? Well, joining us now to give us more insight into cannabis stocks is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Good afternoon, Nima. Thanks for having me.
Now, Brendan, yesterday was 420, so that's a day that's been connected to cannabis culture for decades. But what does this day mean for investors?
Well, I think the original meeting came out of some school, probably in California, where the kids all got together after school at 420 to smoke up. So the date became synonymous with the time, and there we are. Obviously, cannabis has been a big deal in Canada from both a legalization point of view. As you pointed out, we're one of the leading countries in the world for making what millions of people were doing legal anyway. And also from an investor point of view, we are, I believe, the leading country in the world for public cannabis companies. There was a huge interest in these, as there often is when the market first comes to existence. But cannabis obeys the law of economics like anything else, in that eventually there's not going to be hundreds and hundreds of cannabis companies. There will be a consolidation, both because some companies succeed, some go out of business, and also with consolidation. So it might be that this, if I hesitate to use the term second wave, but after the initial flush of enthusiasm and then the falling off from the high, you've seen a bit of a resurgence here, second wind, if you will, and cannabis is getting a little bit more of a puff.
All right, Brendan. Well, I do know that you're on the board of the Canadian Securities Exchange. Now, that was at the forefront dealing with Canadian cannabis companies. So tell us a little bit more about your personal experience dealing with the cannabis industry.
Well, one of my kids joked with me when we were discussing this just yesterday that she wasn't even sure that if I knew what color cannabis was. So my personal experience is somewhat limited. With the Canadian Securities Exchange, actually very interesting. It is quite a bit like the technology sector was for NASDAQ 40 years ago. The NYSE turned up its nose, the New York Stock Exchange, that is, turned up its nose at technology stocks because they didn't have plant and equipment. They just had people and this thing called software. So they wouldn't list, and NASDAQ came into existence because of the software industry. So the Canadian Securities Exchange has been around for 18 years. It just needed an industry that it could do that nobody else could. And the Toronto Stock Exchange wouldn't list cannabis companies with exposure in the US, because you pointed out, while 18 states have legalized cannabis, it's still federally illegal in the US. So for various reasons, TSX wouldn't list those companies. So all the scores of cannabis companies, hundreds indeed of cannabis companies that wanted to become public, they needed a venue, and that was the Canadian Securities Exchange. And we've been a full part of the up and down, but when this exchange got started 18 years ago, or we came into it about 10 years ago, yes, we just needed an industry. Didn't dream in 1,000 years that it would be pot.
All right, Brendan. So I guess the big question here would be, is cannabis a good investment for our investors in Canada?
Well, I think what you've seen when you've had the first flush and then now this sorting out the industry, one needs to look at this like any other industry. There's nothing special from an economic perspective about cannabis. It's company by company within the sector, and those that are able to generate sales, grow their business, have earnings, and because it's a regulated business, as we've seen, not run afoul of the regulatory authorities, because Canada is cutting edge. We can't afford to be offside. So those companies that can do that may end up being, in fact, good investments. My own preference is I can see the medical uses for cannabis. Never been a big fan of the recreational uses, but this and the next wave will actually be psychedelics, where the ability of those to treat symptoms of PTSD and other mental illness issues can be tremendous. So the medical uses, I think, still have tremendous potential from both areas, both sectors.
All right, always an interesting and informative conversation, Brendan. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Nima. Be well.
Stay with us. Coming up after the break, an interview with Franco Terrazzano from CTF. The heads of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are warning that rising interest rates are squeezing the world's poorest countries as they struggle with COVID-19 and soaring food prices. World Bank President David Malpass says there is, quote, a huge buildup of debt, especially in the poorest countries. He says that as interest rates rise, debt pressures are mounting on developing countries. This comes as Statistics Canada reports that Canada's annual rate of inflation hit 6.7% in March. One organization that is expressing concern about inflation and public debt is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. In fact, they're conducting a national debt clock tour. And to tell us a little bit more about this tour, joining us now in studio is Federal Director Franco Terrazzano. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Well, thanks so much for having me here.
So you're here as part of this national debt clock tour, sir. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, we've been on the road. We've been going coast to coast to sound the alarm over runaway deficits and debt. Now, the debt clock is a huge digital display. It's mounted on a massive truck that shows the government's debt going up in real time. So that display is showing the federal government's $1 trillion debt, and the debt is going up by about $1,600 every single second. So we've gone coast to coast. We started in Victoria. We've gone to the East Coast. Right now, we're in St. Catharines. And while we've been on the road, the federal debt has gone up by $8 billion.
Some significant numbers over there, sir. Now, this is very timely, but take us back to when this debt tour first began.
Well, this is actually a new debt clock because we've been actually doing a form of the debt clock tour for about 30 years. We started sounding the alarm over runaway deficits and debt back in the early 90s. But this new debt clock, it's brand new. We had to get a new one. And the reason is that the Trudeau government broke the last debt clock. The last clock just didn't have enough digits to show the government's $1 trillion debt. So I guess we underestimated just how good politicians are at spending everyone else's money.
All right, Mr. Terrazzano, what would you say is the goal of this national tour?
Well, we want to sound the alarm. We want to raise awareness about the $1 trillion debt, and we want Canadians to contact their members of parliament and tell them that enough is enough. It's time to put down the government credit card. It's time to pick up some scissors, and it's time to bring Canada back to financial sanity.
You know, in Forum Daily, we usually display the CTF debt clock, and as you said, it just continues to increase. But these numbers might be confusing for Canadians. So how does the federal debt impact individual Canadians?
Well, and what we wanted to do with the debt clock is we also wanted to show what each individual Canadian owes. We wanted to break it down to make it more meaningful. And right now, each Canadian is on the hook for about $30,000 in federal government debt. Now, I don't know about you, but I certainly don't have tens of thousands of dollars just lying around to pay for our politicians' credit card bills. And that's why it's so important for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to stop this deep dive into debt.
And on top of federal debt, we also have provincial public debt. So what's the state of that across the country, sir?
Well, it's not good for provinces. And in some provinces, I just said, it's about $30,000 of federal debt per person. But you could even add another $30,000 on top of that, depending on what province you live in. And, you know, we have been talking to so many Canadians coast to coast, and we've been asking them why they are worried about the $1 trillion federal debt problem. And here's what Canadians told us. They said that it's not fair to continue to pile on more debt onto their kids and grandkids. They said that politicians have been spending too much money for too long, that higher debt today can mean higher taxes tomorrow, that more debt means more money wasted on interest charges, and that inflation could keep getting worse if this debt continues to run wild.
Clear that Canadians are concerned, sir. So let's talk about some solutions. What is the CTF proposing here?
Well, it's time for the government to stop the clock, and that means they need a plan to balance the budget. And we presented our 75-page budget plan to the Finance Committee, and all the government would have to do to balance the budget is to bring spending back to pre-pandemic levels. And this is why it's so important. Before the pandemic, in 2018, the Trudeau government was spending more than the federal government did during any single year during World War II. So with overspending like that, finding savings in every area of the budget should be like finding water in the ocean.
All right, sir, just under a minute left here, but where can our Canadian viewers go to learn more about the National Debt Clock Tour?
Well, 2 places. You can go to taxpayer.com, as always, check out our newsroom, check out our petitions, or go over to debtclock.ca to see those numbers ticking up.
All right, definitely have to keep an eye on that, sir. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
It was my pleasure to be here.
Stay with us. Up next, we've got more news from around the world, of course. U.S. President Joe Biden plans on sending $800 million worth of weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. Worshippers in Afghanistan are reported killed and injured after a series of explosions across the country. Protesters take to the streets in Indonesia's capital, and the British House of Commons approves an investigation into Prime Minister Boris Johnson. We'll have these stories and more coming up shortly after the break, so stay tuned only on Forum Daily News. We'll be right back. U.S. President Joe Biden is calling Ukraine the front lines of freedom. This morning, Mr. Biden announced that he is sending another $800 million worth of weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. This to help it defend itself against Russia. Earlier today, Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed that his forces had taken the strategic port city of Mariupol. But Mr. Biden says there is no evidence yet that the city is completely fallen. An estimated 2,000 Ukrainian fighters and about 1,000 civilians are now trapped in a massive steel plant in the city. Meanwhile, the UN Migration Agency now says 7.7 million people have been displaced within Ukraine since Russia's invasion began. More than half are lacking some food, but they're also desperate to get cash, financial support, and medicines. Yesterday, the UN Refugee Agency reported that more than 5 million of Ukraine's 44 million residents have left the country. All of this comes as Afghanistan deals with life-threatening violence of its own. At least 10 worshippers were killed as they knelt in prayer, and 40 others were injured in one of a series of explosions across the country. The explosion at a mosque in northern Mazar-e-Sharif occurred as Muslims mark the holy month of Ramadan. This is when the faithful fast from sunrise to sunset. No one has immediately claimed responsibility for the attack or the one in Kabul that injured 2 children. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson can't seem to shake the controversy around attending illegal gatherings during the lockdown. MPs have ordered Parliament's Committee of Privileges to investigate whether the Prime Minister knowingly misled the House about breaking pandemic rules. The move was instigated by opposition Labour Party, and it passed after the government abandoned efforts to get Conservative MPs to block it. MP Steve Baker, who was once a prominent supporter of Mr. Johnson, now says he should be long gone for violating the letter and spirit of the rules. Nearby, the French election campaign continues. President Emmanuel Macron ripped into his far-right challenger Marine Le Pen in Wednesday night's televised debate as he seeks another 5-year term. It was their only head-to-head confrontation before voters have their say in Sunday's winner-takes-all runoff. Mr. Macron tore into Ms. Le Pen for her ties to Russia and for wanting to strip Muslim women of their right to cover their heads in public. Ms. Le Pen, in turn, sought to appeal to voters who are struggling with surging prices. All right, from campaigns to COVID-19. The World Health Organization says the number of reported new COVID cases worldwide actually fell 24% last week to about 5.59 million. The UN Health Agency says the new number of reported deaths also dropped by 21%. But it says the trends should be interpreted with caution, as several countries aren't testing as many people as they once were. Moving to Nicaragua now, where President Daniel Ortega is moving to prevent future protests against his government by university students. Authorities have seized a dozen private universities and closed them or shifted control to the state. A generation of students who protested in April of 2018 saw their education interrupted. Many were forced into hiding, jailed, or exiled when Mr. Ortega's police cracked down. Now others who managed to resume their studies worry that they won't be able to finish. Or they have finished but can't find work because the now state-run schools haven't given them diplomas. Tesla CEO Elon Musk isn't giving up his bid to buy social media giant Twitter. He says he has lined up $46.5 billion in financing. Documents filed with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission say he is exploring what's known as a tender offer. This to buy all of the social media platform's common stock for $54.20 per share in cash. Under a tender offer, Mr. Musk would take his offer directly to shareholders. That would bypass Twitter's board, which has adopted a poison pill defense that could make a takeover attempt prohibitively expensive. Some good news coming out of the East Coast now. A hospital in eastern Nova Scotia has been given the single largest donation in its history. And get this, it was from a taxi driver. John McLellan was a beloved member of the Antigonish community. This is where he spent 63 years driving a cab before retiring after a stroke at 89. Now, he did die in 2018 at the age of 96, but it wasn't until earlier this month that the public learned that he had gifted $1.68 million to St. Martha's Hospital. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.